The battlefield was a wasteland, scorched and shattered beyond recognition. Dust filled the air, and the faint smell of smoke clung to everything. Metal debris from destroyed ships lay scattered across the ground, some still glowing from the heat of the explosions. The sky was a dull gray, heavy with the ash of fallen cities. No one could remember when the fighting had started or when the end would come. The only certainty was that this was a war that would not be easily won. In the midst of this chaos stood Sergeant Jack Montgomery, a human soldier. He was exhausted, his uniform torn, his face smeared with dirt and sweat. His eyes, however, remained sharp and alert. He had seen so much over the last few months that nothing surprised him anymore. The Drakkar were everywhere, and humanity was losing the fight. The once proud human fleet had been reduced to a handful of ships, all scattered across the galaxy, fighting for their very survival. Jack had never thought he would end up on a planet like this. His orders had been clear: defend the human colonies from the alien invaders, push the Drakkar back, and hold the line. But the Drakkar were unlike anything he had ever imagined. Their soldiers towered over humans, their ships were faster, and their weapons were far more advanced. The humans had fought hard, but they had been outmatched. The Drakkar wanted one thing: to conquer everything, to make the entire galaxy theirs. Now, Jack found himself alone in the heart of the Drakkar stronghold. His unit had been wiped out in a surprise attack, and he had barely managed to escape. He had no idea how far he had walked or where the rest of his people were. All he knew was that he had to keep moving, stay alive, and find a way to fight back. But for now, survival was all that mattered. As Jack walked through the wreckage, his mind raced. He couldn't help but think about his family back on Earth. He had promised his younger sister, Emily, that he would come home after the war. He had told her it would only be a few months, but months had turned into years. He hadn't heard from her in over 6 months, and the thought of her being out there alone terrified him. His boots crunched over the charred earth as he made his way toward what appeared to be a ruined building. It looked like an old city, one that had been abandoned long before the war started. Jack paused for a moment, scanning his surroundings. It was quiet, too quiet. Something didn't feel right. He stepped inside the building, the door creaking loudly as he pushed it open. The interior was dark, the air thick with dust and the smell of decay. He moved cautiously, his rifle ready, but there was no sound except the echo of his own footsteps. The place was abandoned. No sign of Drakkar soldiers, no traps, just an empty ruin. Still, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. As he walked deeper into the building, something caught his eye, a flicker of movement in the shadows. His heart raced as he turned quickly, raising his rifle, but there was nothing there. He frowned, lowering the weapon slightly, trying to calm himself. It was probably just his nerves. The constant stress of the war had taken its toll on him. Then he heard it, soft footsteps, almost inaudible, but they were there. Jack's training kicked in, and he spun around, rifle aimed in the direction of the sound. This time the noise came from a corner of the room. He could just make out the shape of a figure, crouched in the shadows. "Who's there?" Jack called out, his voice steady, but his grip on the rifle tightened. He didn't know whether he was about to face another Drakkar soldier or something else entirely. The figure moved slightly, and Jack's breath caught in his throat. It wasn't a Drakkar soldier. It was a woman, a human woman. She was sitting with her back to the wall, her legs drawn up to her chest. Her clothes were torn and dirty, and her hair was matted with blood. She looked exhausted, and there was an air of desperation around her. But what caught Jack's attention the most were her eyes. They were wide with fear, but there was something else, something fierce and determined behind them. "Are you okay?" Jack asked cautiously, lowering his rifle just a little. The woman looked up at him, her expression hardening. "I'm fine," she replied, her voice rough. "Just waiting." Jack felt a flicker of confusion. Waiting for what?" "For the end," she said flatly. Her gaze didn't leave him. "The Drakkar will come for you next. They always do." Jack's heart skipped a beat. He had known the Drakkar were ruthless, but hearing it from someone who had clearly been through the horrors of war made it all the more real. "How long have you been here?" Jack asked, stepping closer. "Long enough," she answered, her voice barely above a whisper. "Long enough to see my friends die, long enough to know there's no hope." Jack paused. He had heard that kind of talk before from soldiers who had seen too much, lost too much. It was the kind of despair that could consume a person, make them give up entirely. But Jack wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. "I'm not giving up," he said firmly, his voice steady. We're still fighting, and as long as we're still fighting, we've got a chance." The woman didn't respond right away. She just looked at him, studying him as if she were trying to read him. Then slowly she stood up, her movements stiff but controlled. "You're brave," she said, her tone a little softer now. "But you're also foolish. The Drakkar are unbeatable. They don't care about your bravery. They care about power, and right now they have it all." Jack shook his head. "I don't care about their power. I care about doing what's right. We might be outnumbered, but we're not outmatched. Not yet." The woman snorted. "You sound like one of those generals back at base, full of speeches and promises. But let me tell you something, talk won't save you out here. You need more than words, you need action." "I know," Jack replied quietly, "and I'm going to act. I'll fight for every inch of this planet if I have to." The woman studied him for a long moment before nodding. "I'll help you," she said, her voice firm. "But don't think for a second that it's going to be easy." Jack nodded in return. He didn't expect it to be easy. Nothing ever was, but he wasn't going to stop fighting. Not now, not when so many people depended on him. "I'm Jack," he said, offering his hand. The woman looked at his hand for a moment before shaking it firmly. "Jara," she said. Jack frowned slightly. "Jara, that's an unusual name." The woman didn't smile. "I'm not from around here." Jack nodded slowly, sensing that she wasn't going to explain further. He didn't push her. Instead, he took a deep breath, ready to get back to the mission. "All right, Jara," Jack said, looking out into the darkened corridor. "We've got a long way to go." And with that, the two of them walked side by side, preparing for whatever came next. The Drakkar had no idea what they were about to face, but Jack did. He had seen enough to know that the war was far from over. The ruins of the city stretched out before Jack and Jara. The air was thick with the smell of smoke, and the ground was uneven, littered with the remains of fallen structures. They walked in silence, their footsteps soft on the broken pavement. Jack's mind was focused on their next move. Every part of him screamed to stay alert. The Drakkar were still out there, watching, waiting for their next move. Jack glanced over at Jara. She had said little since they had met, but her presence was undeniable. There was something different about her, something powerful. He could see it in the way she moved, in the quiet confidence that radiated from her. It wasn't just the way she carried herself, it was in her eyes. Those eyes had seen war, loss, and betrayal. She had lived through things that most people would never understand. Jara noticed Jack looking at her and turned her gaze to him. "What?" she asked, her voice sharp but not unfriendly. Jack blinked. "Nothing, just thinking." Jara raised an eyebrow but didn't press him further. They had both been through too much to waste time on unnecessary questions. The only thing that mattered now was survival. "Do you know where we're going?" Jack asked after a while, breaking the silence. Jara nodded slowly. "I know a place, it's not far from here, a safe house. For humans and others." She paused, glancing around as if making sure no one was following. "We need to move quickly. The Drakkar will be looking for you." Jack didn't doubt her words. He had seen the ruthlessness of the Drakkar firsthand. They didn't stop until they had crushed their enemies. He had to admit, he didn't know what he was doing half the time. He had always followed orders, trusted his commanders, but now he was making decisions on the fly. It was terrifying, but at the same time, it felt like the only choice. They continued walking through the broken city, keeping their eyes open for any signs of danger. The landscape was barren, as if the Drakkar had stripped it of everything that once made it a thriving place. Jack had read about the alien race before, studied their tactics in training, but nothing could have prepared him for the reality of facing them in battle. He had watched his friends fall, one by one, and he had barely made it out alive. Finally, after what felt like hours of walking, they reached an old, crumbling building. It looked like nothing more than another piece of the ruined city, but Jara moved toward it without hesitation, as if she knew exactly where she was going. "This is it," Jara said, her voice low. She moved to the side of the building and pressed her hand against a section of the wall. There was a faint hum and the wall slid open, revealing a hidden passage. Jack stared at her, amazed. How did she know about this place? How was she so calm when everything around them was falling apart? Jara didn't wait for Jack's questions. She stepped into the passage and looked back at him. "Come on, we don't have much time." Jack hesitated for only a moment before following her inside. The passage was narrow and dark, lit only by flickering lights embedded in the walls. The air smelled stale, and the silence was almost suffocating. As they moved deeper into the building, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every corner seemed to hide something, every shadow felt like it was waiting to pounce. "How did you find this place?" Jack finally asked, his voice breaking the silence. Jara didn't answer right away. She just kept walking, her footsteps echoing softly in the narrow corridor. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she spoke. "It was my father S," she said quietly. "He was a leader in the human resistance before everything changed. This place was meant to be a refuge, a place where we could regroup, rebuild, and fight back." Jack frowned. "But why didn't you stay with the resistance? Why were you captured?" Jara's face darkened and she stopped walking for a moment. I betrayed them," she said, her voice tight with emotion. "I didn't believe in the cause anymore. I thought the war was pointless. I thought it was better to surrender to save myself." Jack's stomach tightened. "And now?" Jara's eyes met his, and for the first time since they had met, Jack saw something in them that wasn't just anger or bitterness. It was regret. "Now I wish I had never given up," she said softly. "Now I want to fight, not for the resistance, not for my people, but for something more, for freedom, for humanity." Jack nodded slowly, understanding more than he could say. He had never been in her shoes, but he had seen soldiers give up. He had seen them lose faith in everything they had fought for. It was easy to see the war as pointless when it felt like there was no end in sight. But Jack had never been one to give up, and he wasn't about to start now. They continued down the passage until they reached a heavy steel door at the end. Jara pressed a series of buttons on the door's control panel, and after a moment it slid open with a soft hiss. Inside, the room was dimly lit, filled with old furniture and crates covered in dust. It looked like a forgotten storage room, but Jack could sense the importance of this place. "Wait here," Jara said, moving to the far side of the room. She opened a small door and disappeared behind it. Jack stood in the middle of the room, trying to keep his nerves in check. He had no idea what Jara was doing, but he trusted her. For some reason, he felt like she knew exactly what she was doing. She had been through so much, and yet she was still standing, still fighting. After what felt like an eternity, Jara returned, holding a small metallic box in her hands. She moved quickly, her eyes scanning the room for any sign of danger. She set the box down on a table and opened it, revealing a series of strange devices and wires. "What is this?" Jack asked, stepping forward. Jara glanced at him, her expression serious. "This is what we need to win. This is the key to ending the war." Jack frowned. "I don't understand." Jara didn't answer immediately. She picked up one of the devices from the box and began to examine it. "This is a weapon," she said finally. "A weapon that can destroy the Drakkar fleet in one blow." Jack's eyes widened. "How?" Jara's face was hard as stone. "With this device, we can tap into the energy of the Drakkar's own power. They think they have control of it, but they're wrong. They don't understand how it works. If we can use this against them, we can bring their entire empire down." Jack felt a surge of hope. For the first time since the war had started, he felt like they actually had a chance. But at the same time, he knew this was dangerous. He didn't know how the device worked, or if it would even work at all. But he knew one thing for sure: they couldn't afford to fail. "How do we use it?" he asked, his voice low. Jara looked up at him, her eyes filled with determination. "We have to get to the Drakkar flagship. It's our only shot. If we can plant this there, we can end the war." Jack took a deep breath. "Then let's go," Jara nodded. "But we have to be careful. The Drakkar are watching. They won't let us get close without a fight." Jack's grip tightened on his rifle. "Then we'll fight. We don't have any other choice." They both knew the risks. They knew the odds were stacked against them. But as long as they were alive, they had a chance. And Jack wasn't going to waste it. The days passed quickly as Jack and Jara made their way through the war-torn landscape. The planet had been shattered by years of fighting, but the human resistance had managed to hold small pockets of land in key locations. Jack had never thought much about the grand strategy of the war. He had always just followed orders. But now, as he walked beside Jara, he was beginning to understand how important each decision was. The Drakkar were not just invaders. They were a force that threatened everything in the galaxy. And if the humans were going to win, they needed something more than just brute strength. They needed something the Drakkar didn't have: hope. Jara led the way, moving with purpose. She was no longer the broken woman Jack had first met in the ruins of the city. Her eyes had hardened with resolve, and the weight of her past seemed to fuel her every step. But Jack could see that there was more to it. There was something she wasn't telling him, something she was keeping locked away. Every so often, she would look over her shoulder as if expecting someone to appear from the shadows, but there was no one. "Where are we going?" Jack asked, his voice cutting through the silence. Jara glanced back at him, her expression unreadable. "To the Drakkar flagship," she said simply. "It's our only chance to stop this war." Jack nodded, though a part of him felt uneasy. The flagship was heavily guarded, and the Drakkar had made it clear that they would do anything to protect their empire. The idea of sneaking onto their ship seemed impossible, but Jara was certain. She seemed to know things that Jack didn't. She had been part of the resistance before, and her knowledge of the enemy was invaluable. As they continued on their journey, they encountered more ruined cities. The streets were eerily quiet, and the sky above was dark, heavy with smoke and ash. The planet was slowly dying, just like the human forces. Jack had heard rumors about how the Drakkar didn't just invade. They destroyed entire worlds, reducing them to lifeless husks. The more he saw of this place, the more he believed it. They spent the next few days moving in and out of the shadows, careful not to draw attention to themselves. Jara knew how to move silently, how to hide in plain sight, and Jack learned quickly. They would rest during the day and travel by night, sticking to paths that were far away from Drakkar patrols. But the nights were long and cold, and Jack often found himself lying awake, staring at the stars. He missed his family, missed the life he had known before the war. One night, as they camped in the ruins of an old building, Jack sat beside the small fire they had built. The crackling of the flames was the only sound in the dark, and he couldn't help but wonder what had become of the world he had left behind. "Do you ever think about Earth?" he asked suddenly, not really expecting an answer. Jara was sitting across from him, sharpening one of her knives. She paused, looking up at him with a faint glint in her eyes. "Sometimes," she said quietly, "but Earth is gone. We're all that's left." Jack's heart sank at her words, but he didn't argue. He knew the truth. Earth had been ravaged by the Drakkar before they had even reached the outer colonies. No one had seen Earth in years, and no one knew if it was still there. The thought of never seeing his home again was something Jack hadn't let himself think about in a long time. "I have a sister," Jack said after a long pause. "Her name, Emily. I promised her I'd come back." Jara didn't say anything at first. She simply stared into the fire, her face shadowed by the light. Jack didn't know if she was listening, but he couldn't stop himself from talking. "I don't know if she's still alive," he continued, "but I have to believe she is. She's strong, like me." Jara looked up at him then, her eyes softer than usual. "You'll see her again," she said, almost as if she believed it herself. "We all have someone we fight for." Jack nodded, though his mind was clouded with doubt. How many people had fought and never returned? How many families had been torn apart by this war? But Jara's words gave him a sliver of hope, a hope he didn't want to let go of. The next morning, they set out again, traveling in silence as they made their way through the desolate land. As they neared the Drakkar stronghold, Jack couldn't help but feel a sense of dread. The Drakkar flagship loomed in the distance, a massive structure that seemed to stretch endlessly into the sky. It was surrounded by a fleet of smaller ships, each one bristling with weapons. The sight of it made Jack's stomach churn. Jara stopped and turned to him. "We'll need to move quickly," she said. "The closer we get, the more dangerous it will be. The Drakkar have eyes everywhere." Jack nodded, trying to push his fear down. He wasn't sure how they were going to pull this off, but he had to believe that they could. He had no other choice. They spent the next few days preparing, carefully studying the layout of the flagship and the patrols around it. Jara's knowledge of the Drakkar was invaluable, and she showed Jack how to move unnoticed, how to avoid detection. But the closer they got to the ship, the more Jack realized how much danger they were truly in. It wasn't just the Drakkar they had to worry about, it was everything. The whole galaxy was stacked against them. One night, as they approached the flagship, they found themselves hiding in a small, abandoned building on the edge of a small town. The Drakkar had set up a camp nearby, and their searchlights swept across the ground in regular intervals. Jack could feel the tension building inside him. Every second that passed felt like an eternity. He didn't know if he could do this. He had never faced something like this before. "We'll move at first light," Jara whispered, her voice steady. "Stay close, follow my lead." Jack nodded, trying to steady his breathing. The hours passed slowly, the quiet of the night pressing down on him like a weight. His heart pounded in his chest, and his thoughts kept racing. They were so close, but Jack knew that getting on the flagship was only half the battle. Once they were inside, they would have to plant the device Jara had given him and then escape. It seemed impossible, but Jack was determined. At dawn, they slipped out of the building, moving swiftly and quietly. The Drakkar camp was only a few hundred meters away, and the searchlights still swept across the ground, casting long shadows. Jack's nerves were on edge, but he kept his focus. They moved from cover to cover, staying in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to make their move. Finally, they reached the base of the flagship. It was even more intimidating up close, towering over them like a giant. Jack felt a wave of awe and fear wash over him. This was it. This was where everything would either end in victory or failure. Jara glanced at him one last time, her face hard but determined. "Stay close," she whispered again. "We do this together." Jack nodded, his mind focused on the task ahead. There was no turning back now. He had to believe in Jara, in their mission, and he had to believe in himself. Together, they made their way up to the ship, moving quickly and silently, ready to face whatever came next. The fate of humanity and the galaxy was in their hands. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting long shadows across the cold, steel surface of the Drakkar flagship. Jack and Jara had made it this far. Now they were standing at the base of the enormous ship, watching the heavy security patrols move back and forth like clockwork. Jack's heart raced in his chest, but he forced himself to stay calm. They had no choice but to continue. If they failed now, everything they had done, everything they had sacrificed, would be for nothing. Jara crouched low, her eyes scanning the area ahead. "We'll have to get past the outer perimeter," she whispered. "Then we'll find a way inside. Stay close and stay silent." Jack nodded, his mind focused on the mission. They had one shot at this. He couldn't afford to screw it up. The Drakkar flagship was a fortress, and every inch of it was heavily guarded, but Jara had been planning this for days. She knew the ins and outs of the Drakkar's security, and if anyone could pull this off, it was her. The two of them moved quickly, darting from shadow to shadow, avoiding the searchlights and security drones that patrolled the area. The flagship was massive, stretching high into the sky like a looming giant. Jack's stomach twisted at the sight of it, but he didn't let fear take hold. They had a job to do. They reached the first set of security gates, a large metal wall reinforced with layers of energy shields. Jara moved up to it, her fingers working quickly over a small control panel hidden beside the gate. The seconds felt like hours as Jack watched her, his ears straining for any sign of movement. "Got it," Jara muttered under her breath. The gate clicked, and with a low hiss, the shield dropped, allowing them to slip inside. Jack breathed a sigh of relief, but Jara didn't stop. She led the way, moving quickly through the dimly lit corridors of the ship. The interior of the Drakkar flagship was even more imposing than the outside. The walls were made of sleek, dark metal, and the hallways were wide and empty, filled only with the hum of machinery. The ship was alive with activity, but the crew seemed to be focused on their own tasks, unaware of the two intruders in their midst. Jara led Jack through a series of winding corridors, her movements silent and precise. She knew exactly where they needed to go. The deeper they went into the ship, the more Jack felt the weight of the mission on his shoulders. He had no idea what kind of weapon the Drakkar were using, but Jara was confident that the device they had would be enough to turn the tide of the war, if it worked. Finally, they reached a large, sealed door. Jara paused, pressing her ear to it. After a moment, she nodded. "This is it. The central command room. The artifact will be inside." Jack's pulse quickened. He knew this was the most dangerous part of the mission. Once they entered the command room, there would be no turning back, but Jara's face was calm, her expression determined. She had faced death before, and she wasn't about to let fear stop her now. "Ready?" she asked quietly. Jack nodded. "Let's do this." Jara tapped a small device on her wrist, and the door slid open with a soft hiss. They slipped inside, moving quickly into the shadows. The command room was enormous, filled with towering consoles and rows of Drakkar soldiers standing guard. In the center of the room was a large, glowing pedestal, and atop it sat the artifact. Jack's heart raced as he saw it. The artifact was unlike anything he had ever seen. It pulsed with a strange energy, radiating an eerie blue light. It was the key to everything. If they could destroy it, the Drakkar would lose their power. But there was a problem. The artifact was protected by a force field. Jack could see the energy waves moving around it, making it impossible to get close without triggering an alarm. He glanced at Jara, who seemed to be thinking the same thing. "We need to disable the shield," she whispered. "Stay here, I'll take care of it." Jack nodded, watching as Jara moved toward a nearby control panel. She worked quickly, her fingers flying over the buttons and switches. Jack stood guard, keeping an eye on the soldiers who seemed oblivious to their presence. For a moment, it felt like they were invisible, like nothing could stop them. But then one of the Drakkar soldiers turned. Jack's heart skipped a beat. The soldier's eyes widened as he saw Jara at the control panel. "Intruders!" the soldier shouted, his voice booming through the room. "Alarm! Intruders!" Jack's blood ran cold. He drew his rifle and fired, hitting the soldier in the chest. The Drakkar collapsed to the ground with a thud, but the alarm had already been triggered. Red lights flashed around the room, and the sound of rushing footsteps filled the air. Jara didn't hesitate. She hit the final switch on the control panel, and the force field around the artifact flickered and died. The glowing pedestal hummed softly, and for a brief moment the room was silent. "Go!" Jara shouted, grabbing the device from Jack's belt. "Now!" Without thinking, Jack sprinted toward the pedestal, his feet pounding on the metal floor. He could hear the Drakkar soldiers closing in, but he didn't stop. He reached the pedestal and placed the device Jara had given him into a small slot beside the artifact. There was a brief flash of light, and the device locked into place. "Get back!" Jara shouted. Jack didn't need to be told twice. He dove to the side, rolling behind a nearby console as the artifact began to glow brighter and brighter. The energy in the room crackled, and for a moment everything seemed to stop. Then, with a deafening roar, the artifact exploded in a burst of energy. The shockwave knocked Jack off his feet, and the room was filled with a blinding light. He could feel the heat radiating from the explosion, but he forced himself to stand. The ship shook violently, and alarms blared through the corridors. "Get to the escape route!" Jara yelled, grabbing Jack's arm and pulling him toward the door. "It's starting to collapse." They ran, the sound of explosions and collapsing walls echoing behind them. Jack's heart was pounding in his chest, and his legs felt like they were made of lead. They had done it. They had destroyed the artifact. But now they had to escape before the entire ship came down around them. As they sprinted through the corridors, Jack could hear the Drakkar soldiers shouting and scrambling to respond. The ship was in chaos, and they were at the heart of it. Jara led the way, her movements quick and precise, but even she seemed to be struggling. They reached the hangar bay, but the door was sealed shut. Jara slammed her hand against the control panel, but nothing happened. "We're running out of time," she muttered. Jack scanned the room, his eyes darting from side to side. There had to be another way out. Then he spotted it, an airlock on the far side of the room. Without a word, he bolted toward it, Jara close behind. He pulled open the hatch, and they both squeezed through, just as the Drakkar soldiers reached the hangar. The airlock sealed behind them, and they both exhaled in relief. Jack's heart was still racing, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like they might actually make it out alive. "Let's go," Jara said, a faint smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Together, they climbed into a small escape pod and launched into the air, leaving the Drakkar flagship behind as it burned and exploded in the distance. They had done it. They had won. No one dared approach. The human soldier laughed and sat down beside her. HFY Sci-Fi story.